The morning of March 7th, 1945, began like any other along Germany's western frontier. Oberleutnant Heinrich Vollmer stood in the concrete bunker overlooking the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, watching the grey waters of the Rhine flow past. He had been told by his superiors, men who received their intelligence directly from Berlin, that the Americans possessed perhaps 5,000 tanks total across their entire western front. The Wehrmacht's defensive calculations, their ammunition allocations, their fallback positions, everything had been planned around this number. Vollmer believed it absolutely. Why wouldn't he? The figure came from the same intelligence apparatus that had orchestrated the conquests of Poland and France. But in the weeks that followed, as American armor poured across the Rhine in numbers that defied comprehension, Vollmer and thousands like him would discover that the Third Reich's intelligence services hadn't merely underestimated Allied strength. They had constructed an alternate reality so divorced from truth that the revelation would shatter not just military plans, but the psychological foundation upon which Germany's final resistance was built. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand how German military intelligence arrived at such a catastrophically incorrect assessment, we must first examine the information ecosystem within which Wehrmacht officers operated by early 1945. The German Military Intelligence Service, the Abwehr, had been largely absorbed into the SS Reich Security Main Office following Admiral Wilhelm Canaris's dismissal in February 1944. What remained was an intelligence apparatus severely compromised by Allied deception operations, hampered by fuel shortages that grounded reconnaissance aircraft, and increasingly influenced by Nazi party officials who filtered information to match ideological expectations rather than battlefield reality. The number 5,000 wasn't pulled from thin air. It represented a calculation based on pre-invasion intelligence from 1944, updated sporadically through reports from Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights that had become increasingly rare as Allied air superiority became absolute. German intelligence officers, working from incomplete aerial photographs and intercepted radio traffic, attempted to track Allied armoured divisions through Western Europe. They knew the Americans had landed with substantial tank forces in Normandy. They had documented the presence of multiple armoured divisions during the breakout from the Bocage country. But what they failed to grasp, what the compartmentalized nature of their intelligence gathering made nearly impossible to grasp, was the scale of American industrial production and the speed of the logistical pipeline that fed the Western Front. Consider the reality these German officers couldn't see. By March 1945, the United States had produced approximately 88,000 tanks since Pearl Harbor. The M4 Sherman tank, which formed the backbone of American armored forces, was being manufactured at a rate that would have seemed fantastical to German planners accustomed to the slower production tempo of panzer factories. The Detroit tank arsenal alone was producing Shermans at a peak rate of 1,500 per month during 1944. Fisher Body, a General Motors division, produced another 7,500 M4A2 variants. The Pressed Steel Car Company, the Pacific Car and Foundry Company, the Federal Machine and Welder Company, American industrial capacity, had transformed tank production into something resembling an assembly line for automobiles, not precision weapons of war. But German intelligence saw only fragments of this picture. Their estimates accounted for tanks lost in combat, but dramatically overestimated the attrition rate, while simultaneously underestimating replacement speed. Luftwaffe reconnaissance photographs from late 1944 showed concentrations of American armor, but fuel shortages meant these flights were infrequent and covered limited areas. The photographs couldn't reveal the massive supply depots in England and France, where thousands of replacement tanks awaited transport to the front. They couldn't show the Liberty ships crossing the Atlantic, their holds packed with armoured fighting vehicles. Most critically, German intelligence had no clear picture of how rapidly the Americans could move tank battalions from one sector to another, creating the illusion of fewer total tanks through constant redeployment. The German High Command's assessment of Allied armour strength was further distorted by their own experiences and expectations. German tank production, constrained by strategic bombing, raw material, shortages, and Hitler's insistence on producing technologically complex but numerically limited vehicles, like the Tiger and Panther, had conditioned Wehrmacht planners to think in terms of hundreds of tanks, not thousands. When the Panzer-Lehr Division was formed in 1944, it represented one of the most powerfully equipped armoured formations in the Wehrmacht's history, with approximately 200 tanks and assault guns. That a single elite division, the Americans were fielding 16 armoured divisions simultaneously, each with approximately 260 tanks, plus independent tank battalions, tank destroyer battalions, and separate armour regiments supporting infantry divisions. Oberleutnant Vollmer, standing in his bunker at Remagen, had received the 5,000 tank estimate in a briefing just 2 weeks earlier. The number had been presented as conservative, accounting for American reinforcements and the inevitable exaggerations in combat reports. His regimental commander had used this figure to plan defensive allocations along their sector of the Rhine. With 5,000 tanks spread across a front from Switzerland to the Netherlands, perhaps 200 to 300 might be concentrated for any single crossing attempt. The German defenders had prepared accordingly anti-tank positions calibrated for engagement with dozens of Shermans, not hundreds. Ammunition stockpiles sufficient for a major battle, but not for the sustained onslaught that was actually coming. The broader strategic situation made Germany's intelligence failure even more consequential. By March 1945, the Wehrmacht was fighting on two fronts, with the Soviet armies closing from the east and Allied forces pressing from the west. The Rhine River represented Germany's last major natural defensive barrier in the west. Behind it lay the industrial heartland of the Ruhr, without which Germany's war effort would collapse entirely. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the west, had approximately 55 divisions under his command, many of them severely under strength. Against this force, the Western Allies had deployed approximately 85 divisions, supported by overwhelming air superiority and the logistical capacity to sustain offensive operations indefinitely. But numbers on paper don't capture the psychological dimension of Germany's intelligence failure. Wehrmacht officers in early 1945 existed within an informational echo chamber where bad news was filtered, optimistic assessments were amplified, and any suggestion of inevitable defeat was treated as defeatism, subject to court-martial. The Nazi Party's grip on information flow meant that even accurate reports from the front were sometimes dismissed if they contradicted official narratives. Officers like Vollmer received their intelligence through a chain of command, where each level had incentive to soften negative assessments, to maintain morale, to avoid appearing defeatist. The number of 5,000 tanks wasn't just an intelligence estimate, it was a psychologically acceptable figure that allowed German commanders to believe continued resistance remained rational. The actual Allied order of battle in March 1945 told a radically different story. General Dwight Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force commanded forces that included the U.S. 1st, 3rd, 7th, and 9th Armies, the British 2nd Army, the Canadian 1st Army, and the French 1st Army. The American armoured divisions alone, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, 16th, and 20th, represented over 4,000 tanks, even before accounting for separate tank battalions, British armoured divisions, or the thousands of tanks in depot reserves and replacement pools. The truth was that by March 1945, Allied forces in Western Europe possessed not 5,000 tanks, but closer to 20,000 armoured fighting vehicles of all types, including medium tanks, light tanks, heavy tanks, tank destroyers, and armoured assault guns. This staggering discrepancy, a 4-to-1 underestimate, would become devastatingly apparent in the days following March 7th, when American forces seized the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen intact and began pouring forces across the Rhine. Vollmer's bridge, the Ludendorff, was one of the last standing Rhine crossings by early March. German engineers had been systematically demolishing bridges to slow the Allied advance, but the speed of American armoured spearheads had surprised them repeatedly. The 9th Armoured Division's Combat Command B, racing toward Remagen on March 7th, wasn't expected to reach the bridge that day. German demolition teams had prepared the structure for destruction, but had been waiting for permission from higher command to detonate the charges, permission that came too late. When American tanks of the 27th Armoured Infantry Battalion appeared on the heights overlooking the bridge around 1 p.m., Volmer's worst nightmare began unfolding in slow motion. The bridge's capture wasn't the result of exceptional American planning or German incompetence. It was the product of aggressive American armoured movement, enabled by fuel supplies and mechanical reliability that German forces could no longer match. The 9th Armoured Division had been advancing rapidly, its tank crews operating with an understanding that they possessed both material superiority and operational momentum. When they saw the bridge intact, they simply attacked, knowing that even if the structure was destroyed, American engineers could build pontoon bridges within days, supported by construction equipment and materials that dwarfed anything Germany could still muster. The initial American forces across the bridge were relatively modest companies and battalions, not entire divisions, but within hours, the logistical machine behind them began working. Combat engineers shored up the damaged structure, anti-aircraft battalions deployed to protect the bridgehead from Luftwaffe attack, and most importantly, armour began crossing. Not dozens of tanks, as German defensive plans had anticipated, but hundreds, then thousands, flowing across the Rhine in a torrent of steel that German intelligence had insisted was impossible. Volmer watched this procession with growing disbelief. In the first 24 hours after the bridge's capture, over 8,000 American troops crossed the Rhine at Remagen. Within a week, that number exceeded 25,000. But what truly shattered Volmer's understanding of the war wasn't the infantry, it was the armour. Sherman tanks crossed the Ludendorff Bridge column after column, dozens per hour, hundreds per day, and these weren't just the lead elements of a few divisions. As American engineers completed pontoon bridges and improved river crossing sites, entire armoured divisions began wheeling into the bridgehead. The German response revealed how completely their intelligence failure had compromised defensive planning. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who had replaced von Rundstedt as commander in the west on March 9th, attempted to contain the Remagen bridgehead with forces drawn from other sectors. But the units he sent, depleted divisions with limited fuel and ammunition, were calibrated for fighting the enemy Germany thought it faced, not the enemy that actually existed. German tank crews, often equipped with the formidable Panther and Tiger tanks that were superior to Sherman's in direct combat, found themselves overwhelmed by sheer numbers. For every German tank destroyed, 3 or 4 Shermans remained, and unlike German armour, which operated with increasingly restricted fuel allocations, American tanks moved freely, supported by supply lines, that seemed inexhaustible. By mid-March, as American forces expanded their Remagen bridgehead and additional crossings began along the Rhine's length, the scale of Germany's intelligence failure became impossible to deny. German commanders, receiving reports of Allied armour concentrations that exceeded their total estimated inventory for the entire Western Front, faced a cognitive crisis. Either their intelligence services had been catastrophically wrong for months, or American industrial capacity was even more overwhelming than pessimistic assessments had suggested. Both conclusions were true, and both were devastating. The psychological impact on German defenders cannot be overstated. Wehrmacht soldiers, particularly those who had fought on the Eastern Front and survived, understood that they could be defeated. But they had fought with the belief that their defeats resulted from numerical odds that were calculable, comprehensible, tragic, but not absurd. To discover that the enemy possessed 4 times the armour strength that German intelligence had estimated wasn't just militarily disastrous, it was cognitively shattering. It meant that every defensive plan, every calculated risk, every tactical decision had been based on fiction. It meant that the Reich's leadership either didn't understand the forces arrayed against them or had deliberately concealed the truth from their own defenders. Volmer, who survived the Remagen battle and was captured by American forces in late March, later recounted his moment of realization in testimony to American interrogators. He described watching column after column of American tanks cross the Rhine, counting them as they passed his observation post in the days before his unit's position became untenable. By his count, he witnessed over 300 tanks cross at Remagen alone in the first week. When he mentioned this to his commanding officer, the colonel had simply laughed, a brittle, exhausted sound without humor. 300, the colonel had said. And that's just what you can see at one crossing point. What does that make of our intelligence estimates? Neither man had an answer. The numbers simply didn't reconcile with anything they had been told. The broader implications of this intelligence failure extended beyond the immediate tactical disaster. German military planning for the final defense of the Reich had rested on assumptions about Allied strength that were now revealed as fantasy. Plans for counteroffensives, for mobile defense in depth, for calculated withdrawals to prepared positions, all had been predicated on facing an enemy whose armoured strength was approximately 1/4 of its actual size. The discovery didn't just mean Germany would lose specific battles. It meant the entire strategic framework for Germany's continued resistance was built on a foundation of delusion. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Rhine crossings of March 1945 represented not a single operation, but a cascading series of Allied offensives that exploited Germany's shattered defensive assumptions. While the Remagen bridgehead captured headlines and German attention, it was merely the beginning. On March 22nd, elements of General George Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine near Oppenheim, south of Mainz, in a nighttime assault that caught German defenders completely unprepared. Patton, competitive to a fault and eager to cross before British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's elaborately planned Operation Plunder farther north, achieved his crossing with minimal resistance. Within 24 hours, 6 battalions of the 5th Infantry Division held positions on the Rhine's eastern bank. Within 48 hours, the 4th Armoured Division began crossing, adding over 200 tanks to the bridgehead. The speed of Patton's crossing illustrated another dimension of Allied material superiority that German intelligence had failed to grasp: engineering capacity. American combat engineers, equipped with prefabricated pontoon bridges, bulldozers, and construction materials in quantities that seemed limitless to German observers, could establish major river crossing sites in hours rather than days. At Oppenheim, engineers of the Third Army constructed a floating bridge capable of supporting heavy armour within 12 hours of the initial infantry assault. By March 24th, they had completed a second bridge. By March 26th, they had opened 4 separate crossing sites in the Third Army's sector alone, each capable of handling continuous tank traffic. German forces attempting to contain Patton's bridgehead found themselves facing an operational tempo they simply couldn't match. American armoured columns, once across the Rhine, didn't pause to consolidate or await supplies. They pushed directly into the German rear, exploiting the mobility advantage that overwhelming fuel supplies provided. The 4th Armoured Division, racing eastward from the Oppenheim bridgehead, advanced over 60 miles in 3 days, destroying or scattering German units that had been positioned to defend against a more methodical advance. These weren't the tactics of an army carefully husbanding limited resources. This was an army operating with such material abundance that it could afford to be prodigal with ammunition, fuel, and mechanical wear. Meanwhile, Operation Plunder, Montgomery's massive set-piece crossing north of the Ruhr, commenced on the night of March 23rd. This operation, involving the British Second Army and the U.S. Ninth Army, had been planned with Montgomery's characteristic thoroughness. The preliminary bombardment alone involved over 3,000 artillery pieces firing for 5 hours. Then came the assault crossings by infantry, followed immediately by armour. By the end of March 24th, Montgomery had over 20,000 vehicles across the Rhine, including hundreds of British Churchill and Cromwell tanks, American Shermans attached to British formations, and entire armoured brigades of the Guards Armoured Division. For German commanders attempting to coordinate a response, the situation had become incomprehensible. They were receiving reports of major Allied crossings at Remagen, Oppenheim, and now along a 40-mile front in the north. Each crossing was being reinforced with armor at rates that exceeded their intelligence estimates for total Allied tank strength. Luftwaffe reconnaissance, when it could operate at all through Allied air superiority, returned, with photographs showing supply dumps, tank parks, and bridging equipment that suggested the Allies could sustain these operations indefinitely. The inescapable conclusion was that Germany's intelligence services had failed so completely that Wehrmacht commanders were essentially fighting blind, making decisions based on an understanding of enemy strength that bore no relationship to reality. General Oberst Johannes Blaskowitz, commanding Army Group H in the northern sector, faced Operation Plunder with forces that had been calculated to defend against what German intelligence estimated as perhaps 500 Allied tanks in Montgomery's assault. The actual number was closer to 1,500 in the initial crossing, with thousands more positioned to exploit any breakthrough. Blaskowitz's after-action reports, recovered by Allied forces after Germany's surrender, reveal his bewilderment. In one report dated March 25th, he noted that Allied armoured concentrations in his sector alone exceeded the intelligence staff's estimate for the entire Western Front. He requested clarification from OKW, the German Armed Forces High Command, asking whether revised intelligence estimates were available. The response, when it came, was evasive, an acknowledgement that previous estimates had been conservative without providing concrete revised figures. The truth was that by late March 1945, the German High Command itself no longer had accurate intelligence on Allied strength. The apparatus that might have collected and analysed such information had been degraded beyond functionality. Luftwaffe reconnaissance was grounded by fuel shortages and Allied fighters. The spy networks that had operated in France and Belgium had been rolled up during the Allied advance. Radio intercepts provided tactical information about specific units, but couldn't reveal the scale of Allied reserves and replacement pools. And the ideological requirements of maintaining morale meant that even accurate negative intelligence was often suppressed or diluted as it moved up the chain of command. The material evidence of Allied strength became undeniable as American and British forces broke out from their Rhine bridgeheads in early April. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, was encircled in a massive pincer movement as the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies linked up near Lippstadt on April 1st. Trapped inside this pocket were Field Marshal Walter Model's Army Group B and substantial portions of Army Group H, over 300,000 German troops, along with what remained of German armour reserves in the west. Model, one of Germany's most skilled defensive commanders, found himself surrounded not by superior tactics, but by superior numbers, enabled by material abundance he had been told didn't exist. The encirclement of the Ruhr demonstrated the operational consequences of Germany's intelligence failure. Model had positioned his forces based on assumptions about Allied armour strength that proved to be off by a factor of 4. His defensive plans anticipated armoured thrusts that could be contained by concentrated anti-tank defences and counterattacks by mobile reserves. Instead, he faced American armoured columns operating on multiple axes simultaneously, moving so rapidly that German units often learned they were encircled only when American tanks appeared in their rear areas. The Wehrmacht's traditional tactical skill, the ability to conduct mobile defence, to counterattack against Allied penetrations, to trade space for time, required accurate intelligence about enemy strength and dispositions. Without that intelligence, German commanders were reduced to reactive improvisation against an enemy whose true capabilities they still didn't fully understand. Inside the Ruhr pocket, German soldiers confronted the physical evidence of Allied material superiority in ways that shattered any remaining illusions. American supply columns, when encountered by German patrols, revealed stockpiles of ammunition, fuel, and rations that seemed incomprehensible to Wehrmacht troops who had been operating on diminishing allocations for months. German tank crews, who had learned to husband every litre of fuel, watched American Sherman, Crews simply abandoned vehicles with mechanical problems rather than attempting field repairs because replacement tanks were more readily available than spare parts. The psychological impact of these encounters went beyond mere defeat. It revealed that Germany had been fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity was so overwhelming that the entire material foundation of the Wehrmacht's resistance had been illusory. Oberst Hans von Luck, a veteran panzer commander who spent the final weeks of the war attempting to break out of encirclements in central Germany, later described the moment when he truly understood the scale of Allied strength. His unit, the 21st Panzer Division, had been reduced to perhaps 20 operational tanks by early April. They had been ordered to attack an American supply column to capture fuel needed for continued operations. When they located their target, von Luck found not a vulnerable logistics formation, but a supply convoy protected by over 50 Sherman tanks, a single American supply run guarded by more armor than his entire division possessed. The attack was cancelled. As von Luck later wrote, "We had been told the Americans were stretched thin, operating at the end of extended supply lines. Instead, they were escorting fuel trucks with more tanks than we had in our entire sector. The war, I realized then, had been lost long before any of us understood we were fighting it." The collapse of German resistance west of the Rhine in March and April 1945 followed a pattern that repeated across multiple sectors. Initial defensive positions, prepared based on intelligence estimates of Allied strength, were overwhelmed by actual Allied forces that vastly exceeded those estimates. German mobile reserves, positioned to counterattack expected penetrations, found themselves facing not battalion-sized thrusts, but division-strength advances supported by armor concentrations they couldn't match. Attempts to establish new, defensive lines farther east failed because Allied armoured spearheads moved faster than German units could reposition, exploiting the mobility advantage that unlimited fuel supplies provided. By mid-April, as American and British forces drove deep into Germany from the west while Soviet armies closed from the east, the strategic situation had become hopeless by any rational calculation. Yet German forces continued fighting, in part because the cognitive dissonance created by the intelligence failure made it difficult to process the full scale of the catastrophe. If Germany's intelligence services had been so completely wrong about Allied tank strength, what else had they been wrong about? If the Allies possessed 20,000 armoured vehicles instead of 5,000, what did that imply about their artillery, their aircraft, their overall industrial capacity? The answer to these questions was too devastating to confront directly. It meant that Germany's continued resistance since, at least mid-1944, had been based on systematic delusions about enemy strength, that the sacrifices of German soldiers had been offered to a cause whose hopelessness had been obscured by institutional failures of intelligence and honesty. The human cost of this intelligence failure can be measured in multiple dimensions. Tactically, German units that had prepared defensive positions based on incorrect estimates of Allied strength suffered unnecessarily high casualties when actual Allied attacks overwhelmed their positions. Strategically, the misallocation of Germany's limited reserves positioning forces to counter an enemy that existed only in intelligence estimates rather than the enemy that actually existed meant that German defensive efforts in the war's final months were often ineffective by design, not merely by execution. And psychologically, the revelation that the Reich's intelligence apparatus had failed so completely contributed to the collapse of military morale in April 1945. As soldiers confronted evidence that their leadership either didn't understand or didn't care to acknowledge the true strategic situation. Oberleutnant Heinrich Vollmer, captured at Remagen in late March, spent the final weeks of the European War in an American POW camp in Belgium. There, he encountered German prisoners from across the Western Front, survivors of the Ruhr encirclement, men captured during the Rhine crossings, soldiers who had fought in the Ardennes offensive in December 1944. In conversations with these men, Vollmer discovered that the intelligence failure extended beyond simple underestimation of Allied tank numbers. German forces across the entire Western Front had operated throughout late 1944 and early 1945 with systematic underestimates of Allied strength in every category: aircraft, artillery, supplies, and most critically, the industrial capacity to replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. One artillery officer told Vollmer about preparing defensive fire plans based on intelligence estimates that suggested American artillery ammunition supplies were adequate but limited. When the American bombardment preceding the Rhine crossings began, this officer witnessed fire concentrations that expended more artillery shells in a single day than his entire division had fired in the previous month. The mathematics of this disparity, the revelation that American artillery could sustain fire rates that German guns could match only in brief spurts, forced a recalculation of everything this officer thought he understood about the war's material balance. If American ammunition supplies were effectively unlimited, if their artillery could maintain sustained bombardments without concern for conservation, then German defensive tactics, built around weathering preparatory bombardments before counterattacking, were obsolete before they were executed. Similar stories emerged from Luftwaffe personnel captured in the West. Fighter pilots described air battles where they had been told to expect American fighter escort in company or squadron strength, only to encounter entire fighter groups, dozens of P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, operating with such fuel abundance that they could loiter over German territory for hours, waiting to intercept any Luftwaffe response. Anti-aircraft gunners recounted being briefed that American bomber formations would arrive in groups of 20 to 30 aircraft, then watching formations of over 200 B-17 seconds pass overhead, escorted by fighters that outnumbered all Luftwaffe aircraft in the sector. The consistent theme in these accounts was the systematic gap between what German intelligence had prepared them to expect and what they actually encountered, a gap so consistent that it couldn't be explained by isolated intelligence. Failures, but only by fundamental institutional dysfunction. The reasons for Germany's catastrophic intelligence failure in late 1944 and early 1945 were multiple and mutually reinforcing. Structurally, the absorption of the Abwehr into the SS Reich Security Main Office had subordinated intelligence gathering to ideological requirements. Intelligence analysts who provided accurate but pessimistic assessments risked being accused of defeatism. The Nazi Party's insistence on maintaining morale meant that negative intelligence was filtered or suppressed as it moved through the chain of command. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the OKW, and Generaloberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff, both became infamous for telling Hitler what he wanted to hear rather than what field commanders reported, creating an informational feedback loop where accurate tactical intelligence never translated into strategic understanding. Operationally, Germany's loss of air superiority meant that reconnaissance became increasingly difficult and dangerous. Luftwaffe reconnaissance squadrons, once capable of providing detailed intelligence on Allied movements and concentrations, had been decimated by attrition and fuel shortages. By March 1945, the Luftwaffe could mount only sporadic reconnaissance flights, and even these often failed to return, leaving intelligence staff relying on outdated information and extrapolation from incomplete data. The systematic Allied deception operations, fake radio traffic, dummy tank formations, carefully orchestrated movements designed to mislead German intelligence further corrupted what little information German reconnaissance could gather. But perhaps most fundamentally, Germany's intelligence failure reflected a cognitive inability to process the scale of American industrial mobilization. German military planners, shaped by European industrial paradigms, struggled to comprehend an industrial system that had transformed tank production into a process resembling automobile manufacturing. The concept that a single American factory complex could produce more tanks in a month than all German tank factories combined produced in 3 months was so foreign to German military-industrial understanding that intelligence estimates incorporating such production rates were often dismissed as impossible even when they were accurate. The aftermath of the Rhine crossings and the collapse of German resistance in the West provides a case study in how intelligence failures cascade through military organizations. Tactical commanders like Vollmer made decisions based on intelligence that was wrong by a factor of 4. Operational commanders like Blaskowitz developed defensive strategies premised on enemy capabilities that bore no relationship to reality. Strategic planners in Berlin constructed elaborate plans for continued resistance based on force ratios that existed only in intelligence estimates, and at every level, the discovery that these estimates were catastrophically wrong undermined not just military effectiveness, but the psychological foundation of continued resistance. Field Marshal Walter Model, trapped in the Ruhr pocket with over 300,000 troops, faced the impossible mathematics of Germany's intelligence failure in its starkest form. His forces, supplied based on logistics calculations that assumed limited Allied pressure and the possibility of breakout, found themselves surrounded by Allied forces that could sustain siege operations indefinitely, while simultaneously conducting offensive operations on other fronts. Model, a competent and experienced commander, recognized that the situation was hopeless not because his forces lacked fighting spirit or tactical skill, but because they lacked the material resources to continue effective resistance against an enemy whose true strength had been systematically concealed from German commanders by their own intelligence services. On April 21, 1945, as the Ruhr pocket collapsed and his remaining forces disintegrated, Model dismissed his staff and walked into a forest near Duisburg. There, he shot himself. He left no suicide note, but his final conversations with subordinates made clear that he saw his death not as an escape from personal responsibility, but as an acknowledgement that Germany's military situation had become untenable. Model understood that he had been sent to defend positions that couldn't be defended with forces inadequate to the task, based on intelligence that had systematically underestimated enemy strength. His suicide was, in part, a recognition that the entire framework within which Wehrmacht commanders operated in the war's final months had been built on institutional delusions. The material evidence that emerged after Germany's surrender confirmed the scale of the intelligence failure. Allied force dispositions documented in post-war records showed that by May 1945, Western Allied forces in Europe included over 16 U.S. armoured divisions, multiple British armoured divisions, Free French armoured units, and thousands of independent tank battalions and separate armour formations. The total Allied tank inventory in the European theatre exceeded 50,000 armoured fighting vehicles when replacement pools and depot reserves were included, a number 10 times higher than German intelligence's estimate of 5,000 frontline tanks. This disparity wasn't merely quantitative, it represented qualitative differences in how the opposing sides understood industrial warfare. Germany, even at the height of its power, had mobilized for war within constraints imposed by resource scarcity and the traditional European model of industrial production. The Wehrmacht operated with the assumption that armor was a limited resource to be carefully allocated, that losses must be weighed against replacement rates, that operational planning must account for material constraints. The United States, by contrast, had mobilized an industrial economy so vast that it could sustain losses that would have been catastrophic to any European military power while simultaneously increasing output. American tank production in 1944 alone exceeded 47,000 units. Germany's total tank production for the entire war was approximately 30,000 units. This 3-to-2 production advantage in a single year versus Germany's entire war production meant that American forces could afford tactical approaches that German commanders would have considered wasteful. Sherman tanks could be used prodigally, accepting higher loss rates because replacements arrived faster than losses accumulated. American armored divisions could sustain continuous offensive operations because the logistical system supporting them could deliver fuel, ammunition, and spare parts in quantities that matched consumption rates. For Wehrmacht veterans like Vollmer, who survived the war and returned to civilian life in occupied Germany, the revelation of how completely German intelligence had failed remained a source of bitter reflection. In post-war interviews, Vollmer described the psychological impact of discovering that virtually everything he had been told about Allied strength had been wrong. "We knew we were losing," he said in a 1952 interview. "What we didn't know was that we had already lost, that the material imbalance was so overwhelming that our continued resistance was mathematically futile. If we had understood in March 1945 what the Americans actually possessed, I believe many more would have surrendered immediately. But we fought on, believing that our intelligence services, however degraded, still provided broadly accurate assessments. That belief cost thousands of lives in those final weeks. The intelligence failure that led Germany to estimate 5,000 Allied tanks when the actual number exceeded 20,000 represents more than a tactical miscalculation. It exemplifies how institutional dysfunction, ideological requirements, and cognitive limitations can combine to create systematic delusions that persist even in the face of contradictory evidence. German commanders at every level operated within an informational environment where accurate intelligence was filtered, suppressed, or simply not gathered, creating a gap between perceived reality and actual reality that made effective military decision-making impossible. The Rhine crossings of March 1945 thus became not just military operations but revelatory moments when the accumulated weight of material evidence overwhelmed institutional delusions. German soldiers watching Allied armor cross the Rhine in numbers that exceeded everything they had been told didn't merely witness a military defeat. They witnessed the collapse of the informational framework through which they understood the war, a collapse that made clear that Germany's continued resistance was built on foundations of systematic misunderstanding and institutional dishonesty. The cost of this intelligence failure, measured in human terms, was profound. German soldiers who fought in the West in March and April 1945 suffered casualties, defending positions that couldn't be defended, executing plans that couldn't succeed, resisting forces whose true strength their commanders didn't understand. The approximately 300,000 German troops who surrendered in the Ruhr pocket, the thousands more captured in smaller encirclements across western Germany, the soldiers killed in rearguard actions during the retreat eastward, all were victims not just of Allied military superiority, but of their own leadership's inability or unwillingness to acknowledge the true strategic situation. In the decades since 1945, military historians have studied Germany's intelligence failure during the war's final phase as a cautionary example of how intelligence services can fail their military forces. The systematic underestimation of Allied strength wasn't random error, but structural dysfunction, the product of ideological requirements that prioritized morale maintenance over accuracy, organizational cultures that punished bearers of bad news, and cognitive frameworks that couldn't process the scale of American industrial mobilization. These factors combined to create intelligence estimates so divorced from reality that German military planning in the war's final months was essentially conducted in a fictional strategic environment. For the Allied forces crossing the Rhine in March 1945, Germany's intelligence failure provided operational advantages that accelerated the war's conclusion. American and British commanders, through signals, intelligence, and prisoner interrogations, understood that German defensive planning was based on significant underestimates of Allied strength. This knowledge allowed more aggressive operational planning, more rapid advances, and more decisive exploitation of breakthroughs. The speed with which Allied forces overran Western Germany in April 1945, advancing in some sectors over 50 miles in a single week, was enabled not just by material superiority, but by German defensive preparations, calibrated for an enemy that existed only in outdated intelligence estimates. The story of Oberleutnant Heinrich Vollmer, watching American tanks cross the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen in numbers that exceeded every briefing he had received, encapsulates the human dimension of this intelligence failure. Vollmer was a competent officer, a veteran of multiple campaigns, a man who had served with distinction within the framework of professional military service. But that framework had systematically deceived him about the enemy he faced, leaving him to make tactical decisions based on information that was wrong by a factor of 4. When reality overwhelmed those intelligence estimates, when column after column of American armor crossed the Rhine, when Allied supply convoys revealed material abundance that made a mockery of German logistics, when the sheer scale of Allied operations became undeniable, Vollmer confronted not just military defeat, but the collapse of the informational world within which he had operated. In the final accounting, Germany's estimate of 5,000 Allied tanks facing forces that actually numbered 20,000 or more represents one of the war's most consequential intelligence failures. It led directly to defensive plans that couldn't succeed, tactical dispositions that were overwhelmed, and a prolongation of resistance that cost thousands of lives without altering the war's outcome. Most significantly, it revealed how completely the Third Reich's institutional structures had degraded by early 1945, how ideological requirements had subordinated truth to morale, maintenance, how organizational dysfunction had made accurate intelligence gathering nearly impossible, and how the cognitive limitations of German military planning made processing the scale of Allied industrial mobilization psychologically difficult, even when evidence was available. The Rhine crossings of March 1945, then, were not merely military operations. They were the moment when material reality overwhelmed institutional delusion, when the cumulative evidence of Allied strength became too overwhelming to deny or explain away, when German soldiers confronted the truth that their leadership had either hidden or failed to understand. That truth that Germany faced an enemy with industrial capacity so vast that continued resistance was militarily futile had been apparent to objective observers for months. But it took the sight of 20,000 tanks crossing the Rhine, far exceeding every intelligence estimate, to make that truth undeniable, even to those invested in believing otherwise. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.